Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight you're stepping into a world of candlelight and creaking floorboards, a medieval inn tucked along a quiet road where travellers arrive with dust on their boots and lies on their tongues. You're not a knight or a noble, just an innkeeper trying to keep the fire warm, the ale flowing and the stories straight, even though no one ever tells you the truth. Before we start, do me one small favour. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you want the ultimate immersive experience, consider using a pair of wireless earbuds. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed so you can wear them even while sleeping. I've linked my favourite pair, plus other sleep tools, in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. You wake before the sun has quite decided what sort of day it wants to be. The light outside your shutters is a pale, hesitant thing, more suggestion than illumination. You stretch your hands slowly, feeling the familiar stiffness of early morning, and listen to the building breathe around you. Old timber is generous with its opinions at dawn. It shifts and settles and murmurs, as though discussing your reliability as its caretaker. You accept the judgment with the humility appropriate for one who has not yet had breakfast. When you finally step outside, the air greets you with the faint chill that lingers before the hearths are lit across the village. You pull your cloak a little tighter and cross the small yard, your boots brushing against the dew-softened earth. The inn stands quietly behind you, its walls holding warmth from the night fire, its windows still dark. Only the kitchen cat seems fully awake, already prowling with the certainty of one who has never been lied to in its life. The road beyond your gate stretches out with the sort of gentle resignation that comes from centuries of being walked upon. It gathers dust, loses it, gathers more, and accepts every traveller without complaint. You find comfort in its predictability. The same cannot always be said of the people who arrive along it. A figure appears in the distance, little more than a shape drifting through the morning haze. This is a familiar scene. The slow, steady approach of someone hoping that your doorway will offer refuge or food or perhaps a sympathetic ear. Most travellers want all three, though they rarely admit it. Admitting needs is too honest an activity for the road. You stand by the gate, your hands resting on the worn wood, and let the quiet of the early hour settle into your bones. The traveller comes closer, his stride measured, his posture upright, his cloak far too clean for the story he will undoubtedly tell about escaping bandits or surviving a storm that apparently struck everywhere except the weather itself. You know the pattern well. The dust on his boots is a map he will ignore entirely. He lifts a hand in greeting. You return it with a nod, a gesture that can mean welcome or patience, or merely the understanding that conversation will shortly become unavoidable. "Long night," he says. You give a soft hum of agreement. He asks for breakfast, claiming he has not eaten since yesterday's sunrise, a statement contradicted by the crumbs clinging to his beard with touching persistence. You say nothing about the crumbs. Confronting them would only exhaust both of you. Instead, you usher him inside, where the fire is just beginning to coax warmth into the common room. The scent of last night's embers mingles with the soft perfume of rising bread dough. You stir the pot that hangs over the fire, watching steam curl upward, like someone slowly exhaling a secret. The traveller sits heavily on the nearest bench and sighs in the manner of a man who wishes to be asked what burdens he carries. You oblige him with silence, which encourages confessions just as effectively as questions, and with significantly less effort from your part. As expected, he begins talking on his own. He speaks of hardship, the sort one might admire from a distance, but doubt upon closer inspection. He mentions wolves, of which there are suspiciously many in travellers' tales and suspiciously few in the actual countryside. He speaks of highwaymen, who seem to have robbed every visitor you host, but have never once been seen by anyone living here. He speaks of a spiritual revelation, which appears to have occurred on the exact day he misplaced his purse. You ladle porridge into a wooden bowl and place it before him. He digs in with an appetite that contradicts nearly everything he has said so far. This too is comforting in its own way. Lies cluster around the edges of survival, but hunger remains consistently honest. More figures appear at your doorway as the morning unravels. A pair of young labourers stop for ale and dispute the mileage between your village and the next, each insisting he has walked it more times than the other, though both are clearly guessing. A woman selling herbs claims her wares cure ailments you are reasonably certain have not been invented yet. She assures you her knowledge comes from her grandmother, who, according to the woman's own chronology, would have needed to live to the age of 150 to pass on even half of these remedies. A messenger arrives, dusty and winded, bearing what he calls urgent news. The seal on his letter is broken, the parchment shows signs of having been repeatedly folded, and the messenger's urgency evaporates the moment you offer him stew. He eats more slowly than the traveller earlier, giving his tale an air of practiced gravity. You listen with a calm expression and a mind gently drifting like a leaf on a quiet stream. The truth is that lies rarely trouble you anymore. They arrive with the same inevitability as muddy boots or unexpected rain. People lie out of pride, out of habit, out of fear, or simply because the truth feels too small for the stories they want to inhabit. You have learned the delicate craft of accepting these fictions with a steady, almost affectionate neutrality. After all, a lie delivered with earnest eyes is often just a wish dressed in unsuitable clothing. You clean the table slowly as your guests continue their gentle parade of inaccuracies. The cloth glides over wood, smoothed by years of elbows and tankards and whispered exaggerations. Through the open door, the road waits patiently for the next traveller to arrive and revise the world according to personal truth. When noon light begins to filter through the windows, you step outside for a moment. The breeze carries the faint scent of distant fields. Somewhere, a shepherd's dog barks at nothing in particular, an activity shared by many dogs and most people. You breathe in deeply, letting the air settle your thoughts. Each day begins like this, small lies drifting toward you like leaves in a quiet current, never harmful, rarely creative, always human. You find yourself watching the road again. Someone will appear soon, someone eager to explain why their clothing doesn't match their supposed destination, or why their purse jingles far less than their reputation suggests. You will listen, nodding gently, letting the contradictions fall like soft rain around you. This is the true rhythm of your life, not the clatter of tankards or the bustle of hungry travellers, but the quiet, unassuming ritual of being the keeper of a place where stories come to rest, briefly, before continuing onward. You do not need these stories to be accurate, you only need them to arrive. As the sun drifts higher and the heat warms the gate beneath your hand, you accept with the serenity of long practice that you will spend the day in the company of people who mean well, speak confidently, and remember poorly. And in the soft murmur of the road, you hear the promise of more voices approaching, each one certain, each one mistaken, each one quietly welcomed. You move inside with slow, deliberate steps, carrying the small gravity of someone whose affairs are measured in kettles and towel folds. The common room waits for you like an old, expectant friend. Benches aligned to receive bodies and conversations. A hearth that remembers the exact angle at which kindling likes to be placed. A long table that holds the memory of every spilled cup. You tidy with a practiced hand. Sweep the crumbs toward a corner where the mouse will appreciate them. Straighten a crooked chair until it learns its proper posture. And lift the lid from the bread basket to check that the loaves have not become more crust than comfort. There is a quiet holiness to this work. Each small gesture signals welcome without demanding explanation. You set a pot of stew on the hearth to smear the room with a gentle aroma that says simply, "You are wanted here." Steam threads the rafters, softening the edges of conversation before it begins. The ale casks are rolled forward with the same measured care you have given them for seasons. You know which barrel will murmur of honey, and which will offer the bright, honest note of barley. When you pour a mug, you do so as if filling not mere wooden liquid, but a small, shared ceremony of civility. A poured drink is a promise of hospitality in physical form, warm, steady, and unlikely to demand much more than the swallow it asks for. Guests arrive in honest time intervals, each bringing stories like trinkets wrapped in unreliable cloth. A woman with flour on her skirts asks for a corner where she can rest and keep an eye on a basket of eggs. She claims the eggs were left by a distant cousin who is travelling to the coast, though the cousin's name changes 3 times between her first breath and the 3rd spoonful of stew. You listen anyway and place the basket near the hearth where the eggs will feel safer than any tale you might offer. 2 men follow, carrying sacks heavy with the day's small trades. They sit together as if to practice the art of agreement. Between mouthfuls, they recite an argument about a debt and the manner of its repayment, each telling the same confrontation in a different tone. One speaks as though he was slighted by a nobleman's wink. The other insists he was almost beheaded for his insolence, which seems, at least by the look of both, theatrically unlikely. Their retellings fold into one another until you cannot quite untangle which humiliation happened and which only wandered in for dinner. You slide another bowl their way and let the stew fill the gaps between their stories. A travelling apothecary arrives next, hawking salves that he swears will ease every ache from a child's fever to a widow's insomnia. He speaks with the precise cadence of a man who has measured his words against a scale many times. His hands are stained with herbs and the sort of patient knowledge that prefers certainty to wonder. He insists he learned his trade in a city with towers high enough to prick the sky, a place you have never been and do not particularly want to visit. Still you admire the care with which he folds his knowledge into conversation, and you set him a slice of bread with a seriousness that honours his craft. Throughout the morning, the same scene is presented 3 times in slightly altered frames. The same cart rolls by the window. 3 travellers mention the cart's wheel and its mysterious owner, and each version of the wheel's tail grows a different axle. One claims it belonged to a merchant who cheated the entire market. Another insists it was salvaged from a royal procession. The third simply notes it once bore a child's weight and carries the memory. You listen as their narratives diverge, noticing the way human memory prefers to dress itself in spectacles and banners. None of these accounts threatens the world. They are instead a tapestry of small performances that insist politely on being believed. Your hands are never idle. While voices weave, you arrange mugs, mend a torn strap on a satchel with the kind of stitch that will make the owner feel better about the world, and polish a pewter plate until it reflects a face more composed than the one that stands before it. Politeness is partly practical. Clean dishware is less likely to be cursed, and a well-loosed chair invites confessions. But politeness is also a language, one you speak fluently. It says without accusation that people may say anything in your room and still be offered bread. There is a particular ease in hosting lies that come wrapped in the sort of earnestness that suggests no malice. When a farmer proclaims his apples to be larger than any the county has ever seen, you nod as if you have seen the orchard yourself. When a seamstress declares the dress she mends to be fit for a duchess, you smile and hand her a small coin, because money lubricates patience. You have learned to make space for these extra realities. They are the small comforts that keep your hearth burning. A world enlarged by human imagination feels warmer than one trimmed to strict measures. A child arrives by the hand of a tired mother, clutching a wooden toy whose painted eyes have been rubbed smooth. He looks at the other patrons with a curiosity that shivers like a child's first rain. His mother quietly invents a tale of how the toy won a contest at a fair in a far-off town, and though the toy shows no evidence of such triumph, the child listens to the story with the reverence of someone who believes it is possible to outshine the weather. You give him a small piece of bread and watch the way his shoulders relax, as if a spell has been laid, and the spell is kindness. Then there are the quieter, subtler untruths. A widow speaks of her late husband's bravery in terms so glowing they could be used to fire the hearth. Her voice trembles around the edges, and you accept the polish she applies. You know grief prefers gold leaf. It makes the lullaby of memory easier to sing. You do not correct her. You cannot. The accuracy of her past does not change the softness she needs now. At midday, a small parade of travellers congregates at the table, their stories overlapping like the soft, repetitive rhythm of oars in a still harbour. There is no malice in their errors, only the gentle propensity to make life more interesting, beliefs embroidered into the plain fabric of day. You find amusement in this. The world, in the telling, is always the size of the teller's imagination, and your common room becomes a museum of private geographies. When a disagreement grows heated, you offer more bread. People soften when given something to eat. A threatening gesture dissolves as porridge is slid between bickering hands. A grand claim melts under the weight of a warm mug. You understand, with the practical wisdom of long practice, that satiation is a kind of truth-telling. Full stomachs make for fewer liberties with fact. You do not seek to punish exaggeration. Your role is subtler, to steady the air, to fold conflicting versions into a single gentle hum that makes sleep easier once night arrives. Outside, the road sends another visitor, whose boots still hold the memory of the morning mist. He brings a tale about a bridge that does not exist on any map you possess. His certainty is warm as the bread you offer, and he speaks of the bridge as if it were a doorstep to another life. You watch him speak, recognizing in his words the same human appetite that builds towers of story, the desire to matter, to be seen as part of a larger plot. You pour him ale and let him sit, listening as his narrative settles into the common room like another weather pattern. You move through the day not as a judge but as a curator of small human truths. Each lie you encounter is not a crime but an offering, an attempt to make the world align a little more closely to someone's hope. And you accept them all with the quiet precision of someone who knows that the night will fold these stories in gently, smoothing their edges until even the most elaborate fabric will be soft enough for sleep. By the time the light begins to lean toward evening, the common room is a repository of softened claims and comfortable contradictions. Plates are emptied, mugs are downed, and the chatter tapers into those long, low tones that prefer company to content. You stack the breadbasket with care, sweep the floor with a practiced eye, and set a candle in the window to guide any late arrivals. The art of the polite welcome has done its work. The room is warmed and quieted, its occupants ready to settle into the small private myths they carry. You watch them with a steady, indulgent gaze, knowing that the stories they tell will keep the inn alive long after the coals have cooled. The light in your window is low now, a patient eye watching the lane. The day has thinned into the softer hours, when voices lose their eagerness and take on the slower, more honest music of weariness. Inside the common room, the air is warm with the memory of midday stews and the faint tang of hops. You move among the benches with deliberate calm, your hands doing small, steady work, folding a cloak that has been flung aside, arranging a hearth poker within easy reach, setting an extra plate so the table's symmetry will not trouble a nervous guest. He arrives with the kind of gait that keeps time with the heart. At first glance, he seems like the other travellers. Worn boots, threadbare cloak, a scallop shell tied to a cord at his throat, but something about his eyes tells you he has been holding a space in himself for another presence. He carries a bundle close, as if guarding a secret, and when he sets it on the floor, his hands tremble with relief rather than fatigue. You offer him a bench without fuss. He bows with the small ceremony. Pilgrims are taught by habit, head lowered, palms briefly together, a movement that says he has practiced humility even when the world has not always rewarded it. He speaks in a voice softened by long roads and quieter hopes. "I saw something on the way," he says, and the sentence is both confession and invitation. He strokes the scallop at his throat, as if it anchors the truth he needs to keep. You hand him a cup of ale and a small loaf. He accepts both like a man rediscovering warmth. He speaks of a light, perhaps a column, perhaps a star, that opened in a hedgerow and showed him a path. He says he felt a hand, though whether it belonged to saint or stranger, he cannot say. The details become misty at the edges. Names and time slip through his fingers like fine sand. He pauses, searching for words that will make the moment real, and finds them shifting under his tongue. "It was at dawn, I think," he offers, or else, after the vesper bell. There was a sound, like bells or like wind through tall barley. I knelt. He places his hand over his heart, and it is clear that the kneeling, at least, is a memory he keeps carefully. You do not press him for proof. People come to you with certainty in their pockets and doubt in their pocket side. This pilgrim story is not a wager for you to win. It is a small, fragile thing that needs tending. He rummages in his bundle and produces a scrap of cloth, faded and stitched in a hurried, loving hand. "I wrapped it around the place where I felt the warmth," he says, showing you a corner of cloth that smells faintly of rosemary in the road. He smooths it between his fingers, as if remembering the shape of the miracle might restore its substance. There is no shame in his confusion. If anything, there is an embarrassed tenderness to it. He worries aloud about whether the sign is proof, whether it is enough to change the course of what he carries. He worries for his wife, who sent him away with a blessing and an unspoken plea. Return whole or return with meaning. The pilgrim's need is not for miracles themselves, but for the authority to tell of them in a manner that will be accepted by those he loves. You listen, the way someone reads an old map, with attention to creases and smudges, with patience for where the ink has faded. As he talks, his voice slows and becomes a kind of rhythm, you know. A rhythm that makes the room breathe more evenly. Your silence encourages him in the gentlest way, providing a soft surface for his uncertain truths to be laid upon. Other patrons' murmurs weave around his account like stitching. The apothecary hums thoughtfully, as though measuring the salt of belief against an unseen scale. The two men from the road half listen while rolling a cheese under their palm, nodding in ways that are encouraging rather than curatorial. A child at the table, whose toy has been lost and found twice that day, leans forward with the particular, uncritical hunger of someone who still expects the world to be miraculous on command. "You must be sure of where it was," the apothecary says, but not unkindly. He is a man who gathers remedies and details with equal care. A place grounded in geography helps the tale stand. The pilgrim smiles in a way that might be apology or amusement. "That is the thing," he answers. "I thought it was under an elder tree, but the elder trees here bloom in other months. Or perhaps it was by a dry stone wall. The road was crowded with shadows, and my feet were very cold." You pass him a blanket without ceremony. Letting the pilgrim wrap himself in warmth is less a physical act than an invitation to rest inside the possibility of what he believes. People need places where uncertainty will not be corrected into loneliness. He takes it with hands that used to be steady and are now learning to be so again. As the evening deepens, other tales dampen into ordinary conversation, and the pilgrim's half-remembered miracle becomes a soft focus in the corner of the room. He returns to his bundle and, with a care that suggests ritual, produces a small wooden carving of a hand closed around a tiny loaf. an object that is at once homemade devotion and a proof against forgetfulness. I carved this with my own knife, he says, to remember what I felt. You watch the way he arranges his relics. It is not merely superstition. It is the practical work of making a memory tangible, of giving it a shape, so that it will not slip away when cold nights and early mornings conspire to erode it. You recognize in his actions the quiet craftsmanship you apply to the inn, making small, sensible things last longer than the tempers that first made them. Between the pilgrims' pauses, laughter rolls gently from the corner where the men debate the weight of a coin. Their voices are robust but not cruel. The mood in the room is generous. Its edges soften as though worn smooth by many hands. Even the cat, who has been napping atop a warm boot, lifts her head and blinks slowly, as if offering an indifference that is itself a kind of blessing. He confesses finally, with a sort of trembling candour that makes the room very still, that he cannot quite remember what he promised the voice he thought he heard. "I said I would change a house," he admits. "I said I would mend the things I had broken, but I do not know which things those were." The admission is not a fracture, but a hinge opening. He needs guidance that does not demand performance. You tell him, quietly and without sermon, that the work of change is small and domestic most of the time. Start with what you can touch, you say. A mended fence means more to the next person than grand speeches ever could. Your words are practical, because practical words are often more sacred than grand ones. The pilgrim nods, and the movement makes him look like someone who has just learned a new prayer. Night falls in a manner that feels like a soft curtain being drawn. Candles are lit, shadows gather and keep their distance. The pilgrim settles in a corner of the common room where the light is gentle, and for a long time he sits very still, as if listening for a clarifying sound that might make his memory whole. You refill his cup without being asked, and in the act there is a ritual of ordinary compassion, a warmed cup for a warmed heart. Before he sleeps, he ties the scallop shell more firmly around his neck and lays the scrap of rosemary-scented cloth upon the table. He arranges his carved hand beside it, creating a small altar of private proof. It is not the sort of evidence that will convince the skeptical, but it is enough to steady him through the thin hours when certainty is most scarce. You close the shutters and cast the last light so that the common room becomes a soft pool in the dark. The pilgrim's breathing slows. His chest rises and falls in a rhythm that matches the quiet of the inn. Outside, the road rests under a sky that is patient and untroubled. Inside, small things hold their shape: bread, blanket, carved hand, and the faint, uncompleted miracle that will, in time, settle into the pilgrim's life as a memory that gives him direction rather than an answer that solves everything. You do not know whether he truly saw a sign, nor does he entirely. The certainty here is not in the absolute truth of the event, but in the way the story has been received and kept. In the slow hours before sleep, that is often enough. The pilgrim sleeps at last, his belongings arranged in a neat constellation beside him, each object a quiet promise to himself. The fire has settled into a gentle glow, its embers pulsing like a slow heartbeat. You move with care so as not to disturb the stillness that has gathered in the room. Sleepless hours often rest here, like a second visitor, observing without comment. You tend the hearth anyway, because warmth is a kind of truth, and one of the few that needs no embroidery. Outside, the sky has deepened into the colour of watered ink. The road, which spends its days gathering stories and discarding footprints, begins sending in the twilight travellers. The ones who prefer to arrive when the world feels a little older and more forgiving. You light 2 more candles and open the shutters just long enough to let the evening air swell through, carrying with it the faint scent of hay, damp stone, and someone's distant cooking fire. The first merchant steps inside with an air of triumph that seems premature for someone whose boots are slightly mismatched. He removes his hat, bows with a flourish, and introduces himself as a man whose caravans, he assures you, are so numerous they cast shadows on 3 different kingdoms at once. His coat is embroidered, though the thread looks suspiciously like wool, dyed to resemble gold. You do not correct him. His story is woven as carefully as his sleeves, and unravelling either would only create unnecessary drafts. He orders wine, but after searching his purse, a purse which sighs with emptiness, he settles for ale. He claims this is intentional, a gesture of humility meant to honour the common folk. He speaks loudly, as though volume could take the place of accuracy, and soon he has attracted 2 men from the earlier crowd, who are eager to hear about how one might accumulate such imaginary wealth. The merchant explains his business in terms so vague they might apply equally to livestock, silk, or celestial bodies. You pour another cup, watching the way exaggeration glints in lamplight. Not long after, a second merchant arrives. This one enters quietly, as if silence itself were part of his fortune. He carries a small coffer clasped to his chest, and he looks around the room with the practiced caution of one who wants to be noticed without giving the impression that he does. He pays for his meal with a single coin, heavy-looking but light in your hand, a trick of alloy you suspect. He claims he travels with rare spices valued by kings, though he never removes his coffer's lid, even a finger's width. You respect the restraint. Not all truths, after all, smell of cinnamon. He listens to the boasts of the first merchant with a small smile, the kind worn by those who enjoy a good lie almost as much as they enjoy telling one. When asked about his own fortune, he speaks modestly, which is often the surest sign that the claim is inflated. His voice is smooth, the verbal equivalent of polished brass, warm, reflective, but not entirely what it seems. He hints at negotiations with foreign rulers, but declines to elaborate, saying only that secrecy is the currency of the truly powerful. You nod with solemn appreciation for this revelation, though you suspect most of his negotiations involve choosing which market will charge the least for winter pears. By now the room has gained a certain energy, not loud, not unruly, but pleasantly inflated, like bread dough left near the fire. More travellers drift in, drawn by the promise of warmth, and perhaps by the magnetic pull of boastful men, unconcerned with verification. A woman selling ribbons takes a seat near the merchants and begins knotting her wares with quick fingers. She claims her ribbons have been worn by noblewomen, though the frayed edges tell a different tale. Still, she speaks with such confidence that even the merchant with the coffer seems briefly convinced. You sweep gently beneath their feet, gathering crumbs and stray bits of truth alike. The bristles of the broom make a soft whispering sound, a sort of commentary that needs no voice. The floor is a map of the day's narratives. Flour dust from the baker's wife, a flake of wax from a pilgrim's candle, a seed dropped from someone's travelling pouch. Everything tells a story, though none insist on being believed. Another merchant arrives, the third this evening, and announces before sitting down that he has just returned from a coastal city where ships the size of villages unload treasures beyond imagination. He describes crates overflowing with gems, spices that glow faintly in the dark, and coins so pure they ring like bells. His cloak, however, is torn at the shoulder, and he pays for his drink with a copper piece that has seen more seasons than he claims to have travelled. You offer him stew and receive a story in return. Exchange rates vary widely in this inn, and you have learned to accept all forms of currency, especially those measured in imagination. He speaks quickly, as if afraid the silence might expose him. He recounts a negotiation with a sea captain whose crew demanded triple wages after encountering a storm so fierce it split the horizon. You recognise the structure of a tale passed through many mouths, each one adding embellishments like bright threads to a garment. The merchant insists he managed the crisis with a gesture so commanding that even the waves obeyed him. The listeners nod, content to be carried by the current of his conviction, rather than the logic of the tide. You refill mugs, tending to the slow mechanics of comfort. It is remarkable how easily exaggeration dissolves into laughter when accompanied by a warm drink and a soft place to sit. Even the pilgrim, woken briefly by the murmuring voices, smiles in his sleep before drifting back into whatever landscape his dreams are stitching for him. The merchants compare fortunes, one claiming a warehouse full of wool, another boasting of a caravan that stretches past the horizon, the third asserting he owns rights to a bridge that may or may not exist. Their claims overlap, contradict, and ricochet gently off each other like pebbles tossed into a shallow stream. No one seems troubled by the inconsistencies. Perhaps they believe in these fortunes a little. Perhaps the believing is the point. You watch them with the ease of someone accustomed to hosting improbable truths. There is a pleasure in it, a simple human warmth in hearing people describe the lives they wish they led. Their stories make the inn feel larger than its walls, as if every boast expands the room by a few inches, pushing the darkness outward and inviting possibility to sit at the table. One merchant asks whether you have ever considered selling the inn and travelling with a caravan. You smile, saying nothing. You know that your wealth, humble and unembellished, lies in predictability, the steady rhythm of arrival and departure, the soft knock of mugs on wood, the familiar dance. Small lies being offered and accepted without injury. You sweep another arc across the floor and watch dust motes rise in the lamplight like tiny merchants themselves, bartering the last remnants of daylight. As the evening matures, the merchants grow comfortable enough to admit small truths beneath their towering stories. One confesses that his fortune fluctuates with the weather. Another acknowledges he once mistook ordinary pepper for a priceless spice and nearly bankrupted his business. The coffer keeper silently loosens the latch of his box, just enough for you to glimpse a patch of cloth inside. Brightly coloured, finely woven, beautiful, but certainly not a treasure that would impress kings. You close the lid for him before anyone else notices. Some illusions deserve their privacy. The light in the room softens into a warm amber. Candles shorten, and the merchants' voices become slower, thickened by ale and the comfort of being gently believed, even if only for an evening. You begin clearing the tables, and the sound of scraping wood is as steady and timeless as the road outside. The merchants do not protest. They finish their final boasts in a murmur, as though the exaggerations themselves are falling asleep. When they retire, some to beds, others to corners softened by blankets, the inn settles into a breathing quiet. You gather the last crumbs, brush them into your hand, and toss them just outside the door. The night air catches them, carrying the remains of the merchant's grand fortunes into the darkness, scattering them with the same gentle indifference it gives to all human claims. Inside, the fire sighs. The pilgrim's relics rest beside his sleeping form, and you stand alone for a moment in the comfortable expanse created by all the tales told tonight, an inn stretched by the weight of imagined wealth, yet grounded by your steady hands. Tomorrow, you know, the road will send new travellers with new certainties. But for now, the room is full of soft breathing and the faint scent of ambition cooling into sleep. The last murmurs of the merchants dissolve into the soft breathing of sleep, leaving the common room steeped in that particular quiet that settles only when lies have exhausted themselves into temporary honesty. The fire sinks lower, its glow pulsing gently across the worn tabletops. Outside, the night keeps its slow vigil, lending the inn a sense of insulation from the world's grander claims. You step outside for a moment to draw in the coolness, letting the air rinse the warmth from your skin. A lantern by the door casts a modest circle of light, just enough to create the feeling of a boundary between stories yet to come and the ones already wearing themselves thin inside. The road stretched out into darkness, rustles faintly. A soft warning that travellers rarely sleep at the same hours as the civilized world. Footsteps appear before the figures who make them. Two silhouettes move with the swagger of men who believe gravity should feel honoured to hold them. Their armour clinks quietly, not from grandeur, but from loose straps and forgotten buckles. As they step into the lantern light, you recognise the familiar pairing. Comrades bound by shared exaggeration. Rivals in the art of embellishing victories neither fully remembers. The taller one greets you with a nod so solemn it could be mistaken for reverence, if not for the smudge of dried mud across his cheek. The shorter one salutes with such enthusiasm that it nearly topples him. Their exhaustion betrays them, but their pride insists on a different narrative. Before you can welcome them, they introduce themselves with titles so weighty that it's a miracle the inn's threshold doesn't sag. They claim to have saved the realm. Not recently, though one of them tries to place the event just after sunrise, but sometime in the vague, adjustable region of memory. You open the door wider, gesturing them inside, because men carrying stories this heavy need somewhere soft to unload them. Once seated at a table near the hearth, they order ale with the urgency of men accustomed to thirst and the desperation to forget the plainness of truth. You pour it generously. The taller soldier takes a long sip and begins recounting a battle he claims to have won single-handedly. His companion interrupts within seconds to clarify that he had been the strategist behind the triumph. Their disagreement blooms into a polite argument, the kind where both parties feel obligated to remain heroic while casually undermining each other's valour. You listen with a face trained into serenity, the expression innkeepers have perfected over generations, that gentle neutrality which accepts contradictions the way the earth accepts rain. Without preference, without protest, their tales expand quickly. By the second mug, the battlefield has grown to include siege towers taller than any tower you've ever seen. By the third, they describe slaying opponents who appear from their telling to have been mythical beasts disguised as infantry. The fire crackles in a way that seems to offer commentary. You keep your hands busy, arranging bowls and wiping the table, letting the theatrics drift around you like harmless smoke. A few of the merchants, roused by the rising voices, wander back into the common room, drawn by the irresistible pull of grand claims. They settle in nearby seats, offering nods and murmured encouragement. Everyone enjoys a story that asks so little and gives so much. Even the pilgrim, still wrapped in his blanket, shifts slightly, as though the war tales might enter his dreams and negotiate a peace with his uncertainties. The soldiers' uniforms tell a different tale than their tongues. The taller one's boots are worn unevenly, suggesting months spent marching in circles rather than charging into legend. The shorter one's helmet bears a dent that looks less like a heroic wound and more like the result of a careless pack mule. Yet there is sincerity in their voices, a sincerity formed not from fact, but from the yearning to be remembered, to have mattered somewhere, even briefly. You notice that when they describe their supposed heroics, they lean toward each other unconsciously. Their shoulders align, their breaths sink just enough to reveal that beneath the competition lies a bond forged in some real hardship, though whether it was a battle or a long march through poor weather is unclear. Sometimes truth hides inside a lie, the way warmth hides inside embers, faint but still present. Their tale shifts, as drunken stories do, into a dramatic reenactment. The taller one stands, nearly knocking over the bench, and demonstrates how he lifted an entire siege ladder on his own. The shorter one insists he held off 50 enemy soldiers with a single dagger, though he admits this dagger has since been misplaced. They illustrate their feats with such conviction that even your broom seems to pause mid-sweep, unwilling to interrupt. You let them continue, recognizing that some lies are simply rehearsals for the courage people wish they had possessed. Hospitality involves offering space not only for bodies, but for the narratives that keep those bodies upright. Between boasts, fragments of truth seep out, small admissions slipped in like accidental footnotes. They mention comrades lost to illness rather than war. They speak of long marches through barren fields, where hunger gnawed at discipline. They describe commanders who forgot their names, but remembered to write reports about numbers. These confessions arrive unadorned, without the shine applied to the rest of their story, and they reveal something gentler. Men who have learned to survive disappointment by reshaping it. You refill their mugs with a quiet ritualism. When ale meets wood, the room seems to breathe more steadily. The merchants hum in approval at the soldiers' tales. The ribbon seller covers her smile with her hand, enjoying the spectacle more than the substance. The apothecary raises an eyebrow as though calculating the odds of surviving any of the battles described. Gradually, their stories soften. Perhaps the ale loosens not only their tongues, but also their grip on the need to impress. They begin speaking more plainly, of cold camps, of letters from home that never reached them, of moments when courage felt less like a virtue and more like the absence of alternatives. You find these quieter pieces more compelling than the thunderous fictions. There is something profoundly human in the attempt to turn hardship into grandeur. People rarely lie to deceive you. More often, they lie to repair themselves. The shorter soldier leans back, rubbing the dent in his helmet. "We weren't completely alone," he admits softly, glancing at his companion. "We had each other, I suppose." The taller one nods, his posture relaxing. "Aye, and fires. Bad fires mostly. Too smoky." The simplicity of the statement feels more heroic than anything they've claimed so far. The night deepens. One by one, the listeners drift to their resting places, leaving only a handful still awake. The soldiers finish their ale. Though finish is an ambitious term, most of it has found its home on the table rather than in their mouths. You place a blanket over the shorter soldier when he slumps forward, and he mumbles something about protecting the eastern tower, though there is no tower and certainly no east inside your common room. The taller soldier remains upright long enough to declare, with surprising earnestness, that if the realm ever needs saving again, they will step forward without hesitation. His voice holds no boast now, only a weary sincerity that softens the edges of the night. He finally allows himself to lie down on the bench, using his rolled cloak as a makeshift pillow. When both have succumbed to sleep, the room returns to its gentle equilibrium. You extinguish a few candles, leaving enough light for dreamers to navigate if needed. Their armour glints faintly in the dim glow, less like the regalia of heroes and more like the discarded shells of men still searching for a story that fits them. You stand for a moment in the settling quiet, observing how grand tales shrink peacefully once the telling ends. The inn holds them all, the exaggerated merchants, the uncertain pilgrim, the contradictory weather prophets, and now these soldiers with their patched bravery. Each night weaves a new layer into the atmosphere, a soft tapestry of human attempts at significance. You sweep slowly, letting dust gather in neat arcs, content in the knowledge that you needn't verify any of the claims made beneath your roof. The truth here is softer, patient, and shaped by the needs of those who speak it. And as the last ember glows quietly in the hearth, you welcome the comfort of another night where stories, even unlikely ones, are allowed to rest. The inn settles into a gentle hush, holding its sleepers like pages pressed beneath a warm hand. The soldiers' soft snores rise and fall in uneven duet, the kind of sound that, over time, becomes part of the building's natural rhythm. You let the quiet wrap around you as you tend to the last remnants of the evening. The mugs drying near the hearth, the soft glow threading through the rafters, the faint imprint of exaggerated heroism still lingering in the air like the aftertaste of a strong herb. You step outside again, if only for a breath. The road lies still, resting under the pale shimmer of moonlight. It always fascinates you how the road, so full of competing truths by day, becomes pure and untroubled at night. A long ribbon of darkness unbothered by human contradiction. You inhale the cool air, letting your mind loosen its grip on the night's grand claims, when a figure emerges at the edge of the lamplight. She approaches with the tentative caution of someone playing a role she rehearsed only briefly. Her cloak is coarse, the kind worn by field workers, but it drapes over her shoulders with aristocratic precision. The hood shadows her face, though the faint glimmer of polished rings betrays a lineage far too nourished for peasant life. And there is the unmistakable scent, subtle, expensive, impossible to confuse with the earthy aroma of those who truly labour in soil. It arrives a moment before she does, like a rumour travelling faster than its subject. You open the door for her without comment. The art of innkeeping often involves allowing a disguise to remain whole, even when it fools no one. She steps inside, clutching her cloak tightly, scanning the room as though expecting someone to leap out and shout her name. When she sees only sleeping bodies and the flickering hearth, her shoulders loosen by the smallest degree. She takes a seat near the fire, choosing a bench that gives her both warmth and a strategic view of the door. You recognise the posture, that delicate balance between attempting anonymity and commanding the room through sheer, involuntary bearing. She folds her hands, hiding the rings only halfway, the effort reminiscent of a child trying to conceal a pastry by placing it behind their back while crumbs betray them. You approach her with quiet steps, offering a cup and a small loaf. She thanks you in a voice carefully lowered, as though her usual tones might spill her identity across the room. The softness of her speech contrasts with the firmness of her manner. Each word holds the shape of someone accustomed to giving orders, even when pretending to request them. She claims to be a simple traveller, passing through on her way to a nearby village. She mentions a name, of the village, or of herself, you cannot be certain, but the syllables carry the particular elegance of noble dialect, a polished sound rarely found in the mouths of those who barter over grain and weight. Each detail she adds contradicts another, though none of it is done maliciously. It is the sort of performance that relies on the hope that strangers will not notice small absurdities. You nod with the same composure you offer to merchants, who describe caravans they've never seen, and soldiers who defeat armies that never assembled. Her disguise, like theirs, is another tender construction, meant to tide the mind over until morning. She speaks in vague terms about needing rest. Her fingers brush the carved arm of the bench with the caution of someone unused to coarse furniture. A stray splinter catches her sleeve, and she jumps ever so slightly, then pretends she meant to adjust her cloak. You avert your eyes politely, granting her the gift of unobserved embarrassment. A few patrons stir at the sound of her voice. The ribbon seller opens one eye. The apothecary shifts beneath his blanket, but none react to her presence. Sleep or indifference shields them, and perhaps that is for the best. The noblewoman relaxes further, believing her disguise safe enough. She removes her hood, revealing a face too well cared for to have spent long days under harsh sun. Her hair, though loose and intentionally tousled, still falls with the glossy assurance of wealth. She folds the hood into her lap delicately, the gesture refined even in its plainest execution. When she drinks, she does so in tiny sips, as though each swallow is being monitored by an invisible court. She flinches once at the strength of the ale, then catches herself and pretends to enjoy it, tilting her chin in an angle that suggests she is accustomed to being observed, even in private moments. She tries to hold a casual conversation with you. The questions she asks are simple: travel times, road conditions, whether the inn receives many guests this late. Yet her phrasing reveals a life steeped in etiquette manuals, not muddy roads. She listens intently to your answers, nodding as if gathering intelligence rather than information. Between her careful inquiries, small truths slip through. The name of someone she is avoiding, the mention of a crest she pretends not to recognize, a passing reference to a quarrel that sounds too large for ordinary people to have been involved in. You piece together what she avoids saying aloud. She has fled something tangled, perhaps political, perhaps domestic, but certainly of noble scale. And like many who leave privilege behind for a night, she believes the world cannot recognize her beneath a cloak 2 shades poorer than her usual attire. You treat her with the same courtesy you offer every guest, though your silence is customized to her particular needs. It is a silence that acknowledges what she wants hidden without granting it enough weight to cause her anxiety. You refill her cup with gentle precision, as though participating in a ceremony known only to the two of you, the ceremony of polite pretense. She relaxes enough to look around the room without fear. Her eyes soften when they fall upon the sleeping pilgrim, the collapsed soldiers, the merchants sprawled like discarded finery. The sight seems to comfort her, a reminder perhaps that everyone here is sheltering from something, whether it be cold, memory, or truth. As the ale works its subtle alchemy, her posture loosens further. She begins to speak more freely, not of her station, but of the simple things she wishes she were allowed to enjoy. Walking without attendance, choosing her own supper, wearing clothes not sewn with lineage. Her voice carries a longing too gentle to be political. It is merely human, the kind that surfaces in safe rooms where no titles follow. She laughs once, a small startled sound, quickly muffled, when she realizes she has begun to describe a life more suited to the ribbon seller than to a woman who once sat on velvet cushions to receive petitions. You do not laugh, but your expression softens, allowing her to keep the moment without regret. When you offer her a blanket, she hesitates. Accepting comfort feels to her like revealing dependence. But the fire is dimming, and the night has teeth even for those raised among tapestries. She finally accepts it, holding the wool against her like a shield. Wrapped in the coarse fabric, she looks oddly at ease, as though anonymity has given her a warmth noble life rarely affords. Before sleep claims her, she removes her rings, all but one, and tucks them into a fold of her cloak. The one she keeps is small, less ornate, perhaps sentimental. She holds it between her fingers for a moment, tracing a pattern on its surface, then sets it under her cheek as she lies on the bench. Her final, whispered words drift upward into the rafters, barely more than a sigh. Just for tonight, let no one know my name. You nod, though she cannot see you. The room has already accepted her secret without question, weaving it into its quiet tapestry of travellers' half-truths. You extinguish a candle, leaving only enough light for the fire to cast warmth on her resting form. The ring glints softly beneath her hand, the only sign of the life she is temporarily shedding. You return to your quiet duties, letting the night fold her into a gentleness she may not often receive. The inn keeps her secret effortlessly, as it keeps so many others, not by denying the truth, but by treating it as another small, decorative detail that looks lovelier when left undisturbed. Night settles over the inn like a comfortable cloak, its weight reassuring rather than oppressive. The fire breathes slowly, sending occasional sparks up the chimney that vanish like small, private promises. You move through the common room with the ease of someone whose hands remember every creak and hinge. The bench near the hearth remembers the imprint of 1,000 elbows. The table knows where people prefer their mugs, and the rafters keep the echo of laughter like a secret tucked into the beams. The occupants have arranged themselves into the shapes of sleep. The pilgrim's breath is steady, as if wrapped in whatever soft certainty he can carry. The soldiers are rolled into the rough, honest slumber of men who have nothing left to prove tonight. The merchants breathe with the tired swagger of those whose riches were measured mostly in language, and the noblewoman lies with one ring still glinting like a star that does not want to be alone. Even the cat sprawls with the sovereign confidence of an animal that trusts the night to do what it must. You take up the mop and bucket because a room that holds so many voices deserves careful cleaning. The water is warm and fragrant with the faint scent of soap and citrus. When you dip the mop into it, steam rises in delicate tendrils, joining the smoke of the dying fire. Your broom strokes are slow and almost meditative, a pattern of arcs that makes the floor shine and, oddly, seems to coax the gossip into a softer shape. Rumours do not sleep in the same way bodies do. They slink and whisper, slipping from tongue to ear in half-formed sentences that continue their motion when people are no longer awake to claim them. They travel along the beams, slide across the table, and nestle under the plates as if the inanimate objects are complicit keepers of small untruths. You hear them as the mop glides, a fragment about a bridge that collects tolls twice over, a surer detail that a certain lord has lost a title but not his appetite, a softer murmur about a widow who may or may not have inherited far more than anyone suspected. The sound of rumour is almost musical. It does not need the full company of speech to exist. A half syllable is enough to push it forward. It is clever in the way it chooses what to become. Sometimes it expands into scandal. Sometimes it shrinks into a comforting explanation for an awkward absence. You notice how the room inhales these stories and breathes them out with the calm of practiced repetition. The inn makes a home for such things. A whisper brushes past your ear, the tail end of a conversation, too complicated to be finished before sleep took it. You listen without judgment. Rumours are a kind of human industriousness, a way of rearranging the world to make sense of the places where facts leave gaps. In the way people tell them here, they are rarely cruel. They are more like quilts stitched from mismatched cloth, warm and oddly beautiful. You pause and wipe a stubborn stain near the door. The stain remembers the afternoon. Spilled ale, a dab of stew, perhaps a smear of ink from a hurried letter. It holds a small narrative in its stubbornness. You press the mop into it with steady pressure and watch it lighten. One layer of the room's story erased to reveal the plain wood beneath. Other stains will remain. Some narratives cannot be cleaned away and would be sadder for disappearing. From the corner by the hearth comes a soft conspiratorial chuckle. No one awake enough to own it, and yet it hangs in the air like a ghost of amusement. You think of the noblewoman's careful disguise and the merchant's shimmering claims of soldiers with their patchwork valour and the pilgrim's uncertain miracle. Each rumour seems to orbit one of them, as if the human need for drama is a kind of magnet. No accusation is thrown like a stone. Instead, whispers gather into polite bouquets, arrangements of suggestion, tied with the ribbon of possibility. Sometimes the rumours touch on the practical, whether the river near town will rise enough to wash the wheat stores away, whether the apothecary's salve will cure more than it merely soothes. Sometimes they are gentle fictions, meant to sustain someone's pride, or soothe a neighbour's fear. A widow imagined rich so the gossiping will not have to imagine her poor. You move through these murmurs like someone passing a hand over a sleeping animal, delicate, careful, recognising the life within. The cat wakes, stretching with deliberate slowness, and pads toward the pilgrim's boots, where crumbs have gathered. It is the sort of movement that sets off a new thread of conversation, even when the sleepers do not reply. The cat's pink nose sniffs the air, and, by happenstance or design, a whisper slips into a full sentence. The ribbon seller's arrival was not as innocent as she made it sound. Perhaps she was carrying letters for a distant hand. The sentence finds its way into the rafters and drops like a leaf onto the shoulder of a blanket. You mop in a circle now, the motion steady and inward, as though drawing the room together. The act of cleaning the floor becomes a quiet reintegration of scattered narratives. You think of how the inn itself functions as a seam, a place where threads of lives are joined, knotted, and then left to dangle until someone picks them up again. There is a comfort in this delicate disorder. It lets people be more than the small facts of their days. It gives them permission to be bigger or smaller or more strange than they might otherwise allow. A rumour about a bridge, that fanciful structure whose tolls were doubled in half the stories, takes on a new character as the night stretches. It becomes less an accusation and more a parable about trust. The merchants, whose voices still echo in your memory, become both villains and victims in the retelling. The story softens into an observation about how people prefer bold explanations to inconvenient logistics. You smile faintly as the mop leaves a clean crescent. Even gossip has a life cycle here, and much of it ages into gentleness. At one point you stop and listen to the wood under your feet. The building murmurs back in old familiar tones. The framing sighs. The boards remember where a nail slipped long ago. The hearth radiates a slow heat that seems to hold the past in place. The inn is a patient witness, and you are its careful chronicler, not by writing, but by tending. You gather the empty mugs and plate like someone collecting small, evidence-laden fossils, placing them in a neat stack that reads like a ledger of human appetite and diversion. You pass the sleeping soldiers and smooth the edge of the shorter man's cloak where it has bunched awkwardly. The motion is practical, but it carries tenderness. People behave better toward objects in their sleep. Perhaps it is easier to forgive the living when they are not awake to protest. A rumour settles at their feet, a subtle embellishment about a battle, no longer quite necessary now that it has been told. It will sit there until morning, less sharp than it began, softened by the cool air and your careful sweeping. The pilgrim murmurs in his sleep. You hear a syllable that sounds like the name of a place he cannot quite reach in waking hours. The noblewoman shifts, and in doing so, releases the faint clink of the ring she keeps. The sound is tiny, but it wakes a string of speculation, spinning out into the rafters like thread. A whisper says she may be leagued with a cousin who is more dangerous than fashionable. Another posits she is running from a marriage more rumoured than real. The stories grow a kindness of their own, hedging scandal with nostalgia. As the mop completes its slow, circular journey, you set it aside and fetch a clean cloth to polish the table. The act of polishing is almost ceremonial. It makes the wood shine and seems to make the room more honest merely by improving the view. Polished wood reflects faces in a more flattering light, and tonight that feels like another form of mercy. You extinguish the last but one candle, leaving a single pool of lamplight to guard the sleeping shapes. The quiet is not empty. It is full of the soft residue of talking and eating and being human in a place that tolerates the small thefts of truth. People need to keep themselves whole. Outside, the road sleeps. Inside, rumours curl into corners and rest like small animals, warmed by the presence of your roof. You sit for a while at the table, hands folded, watching the shadows move as if reading. There is a comfort in the way stories travel here. They are not weapons but blankets. They tuck themselves around shoulders that have grown too thin and provide something that memory cannot always supply, a version of events that keeps embarrassment and fear at bay. When at last you rise to stoke the fire, you do so with the knowledge that the room has been arranged for a gentle continuation of life. The rumours will wake with the dawn, perhaps altered, perhaps kinder, perhaps more ridiculous. They will become breakfast conversation, the sort that marshals people into sympathy for one another's small failures. For now, you let them sleep, tucking them in with a sweep of your hand, as though smoothing the covers over the world. Dawn edges the sky with a thin pale, and the inn exhales a long, dust-soft breath. The sleepers stir and groan as if remembering the world all at once. The pilgrim's hand reaches for the scallop in a dream. The shorter soldier mumbles about a missing dagger, and the noblewoman tucks a single ring deeper into the fold of her cloak. You move through the half-light with the quiet certainty of someone who has already measured the day's weight and found it bearable. The first steps that reach the door this morning are not the slow, tired ones of a traveller seeking warmth, but brisk and precise, like the tapping of a quill on parchment. He arrives with a ledger under his arm and a face folded from business, narrow, unreadable lines that have been pressed by duty. The tax collector announces himself with a tone that is neither harsh nor kindly. It is simply the voice of someone who expects the world to conform to lists. You welcome him with the same composed hospitality you offer everyone who crosses the threshold. A nod, a bowl, the unspectacular courtesy of being acknowledged. He inspects the room as if scanning it for columns in a census. His gaze counts corners and evaluates chairs the way a farmer counts sheep, and you feel recorded in a manner that is polite but precise. He sits at the table closest to the door, arranges his ledger like a shield, and watches you with the focus of someone who trusts numbers more than people. He asks for bread and stew, but tastes it as if testing whether the world intends to poison him. The spoon he lifts is observed so closely, you half expect him to demand a catalogue of its manufacture. "Where did you get these sheets?" he asks abruptly, eyeing a folded linen near the hearth. It is a practical question, but asked with the urgency of an accusation. He runs his finger along the cloth's edge, as if searching for a stamp or a place where a signature might have been sewn. You answer with the simple facts. You buy from the merchant in the square. You mend tears your own hands make, and you wash them on market days. The tax collector nods but does not relax. His suspicion hangs in the air like a gauze. He lifts the spoon again and turns it over as though the reflected light might reveal an extra coin tucked in its curve. There is something oddly human about his distrust. It is not malicious. Rather, it is the armour he has forged against a life of being owed things. People have offered him false accounts, coins clipped thin at the edges, and ledgers smudged with the grease of convenient forgetfulness. You pour him more ale, and his hand trembles slightly before taking the cup, perhaps from habit, or perhaps from the weight of calculation that never quite settles. As he eats, he speaks in careful pronouncements, not stories. He tells you of routes he has walked, of markets he has inspected, of a noble steward who once attempted to claim 3 bushels of grain as one. His voice delivers facts the way a mason lays stones, straight and deliberate. Yet between the facts, there is a loneliness, a plainness that makes the rest of the common room, with its storytellers and exaggerators, feel like a place designed by instinct rather than ledger. He confesses, almost as an aside, that he trusts only the numbers that refuse to waver. "Paper does not lie," he says, tapping the ledger, where his ink dries in neat black marks. "People do." The statement has the bluntness of someone who has found comfort in immutability. You do not contradict him. Instead, you set a fresh slice of bread before him and let the warmth of it stand as an answer, softer than debate. Others at the table glance toward him with curiosity, the way birds glance at a figure in a new hat. The merchants look up with the practiced mildness of men who know the inconveniences of taxes, but prefer to live in tales of wealth rather than in ledgers. The ribbon seller smooths a strand of ribbon and pretends interest in his questions while continuing to knot. The soldiers, roused from half-sleep, listen and find in the tax collector's rigid account a counterweight to their own habit of enlarging events. His presence reorders the room briefly, like someone straightening a row of cups until the symmetry appeases an underlying unease. He lifts his spoon again, turning it in the light, and this time he begins to interrogate it, more as metaphor than metal. "Who polished you?" he asks the utensil out loud, eyes narrowed with mock seriousness. The question is absurd enough to dissolve some of the air's tension. A small laugh drifts from the table where the merchants sit. The sound is the tiniest thaw in the frost of suspicion. His humour is dry and cautious. He allows himself a half smile at the notion of a polished spoon having a biography, then quickly retreats into the safety of numbers. He tells a short tale about a village who once tried to report fewer mouths than there actually were, a skirting of truth that cost them dearly in the long run. The moral is as straightforward as a coin's edge. Falsehoods compound. You listen and, when the moment feels right, you offer an observation that is not recorded in ledgers. People tell versions of themselves that help them sleep, you say, folding the cloth you use to dry mugs. Sometimes those versions keep them going. Sometimes they fool themselves into trouble. Your words are not an argument, but a small bridge between his world and the rest of the inn's more imaginative life. He studies you then, his ledger temporarily forgotten. "And who keeps you honest?" he asks. And there is no bite in the question, only curiosity. It is the sort of question that betrays an appetite for a different kind of accounting. Moral rather than monetary. Small acts recorded in memory rather than ink. You could tell him that keeping honest is a communal affair, a nod from a good neighbour, a returned tool, a coin discreetly slid back into a purse. But you choose instead to describe a scene. The pilgrim leaving a scrap of cloth upon the table, as if to anchor a memory. The soldiers folding a shared blanket across two benches, as if to share the night's warmth. The noblewoman tucking her ring beneath her cheek. Small acts, you say, that do not make it into ledgers, but matter in the long calculus of living. He considers this and makes a small sound that might be agreement. You refill his cup once more, and when he looks at the spoon again, he seems less inclined to interrogate it. Perhaps something about the room, the steady, ordinary care with which you run it, persuades him that not all value can be tallied with ink. He then, with a softness at odds with his earlier suspicion, confesses he has been counting too long. There is a weariness that comes with asking men to be what they say, he admits, eyes drifting briefly to the sleeping forms. Sometimes I think the books are for me more than for them. The candour surprises even him. The admission feels like setting down a weight. You slide a coin across the table without ceremony. It is small and common, not a thing to be recorded in his ledger, but a thing to be felt. "Keep this for the road," you say simply. Counting is easier sometimes when you have less to carry. He accepts it with more gratitude than he usually allows, tucking it not into a purse, but into the inner page of his ledger, as if it has more value as a comfort than as payment. When he finally rises, he does so with a slightly loosened posture. He closes his ledger with a soft, thoughtful sound, and polishes his fingers across the cover, as if sealing more than figures inside. He thanks you in a manner that suggests an understanding has passed between you, not a contract, but a quiet exchange. Hospitality for a single, honest hour. As he departs, the road receives him in the pale morning like a patient audience. You watch him go with a private sense of satisfaction. The world will continue to offer you claims and counterclaims, coins that glitter and coins that hide. But this morning has given you a small, unrecorded victory. A man who trusts numbers a little less and people a little more. You remain at the table for a time after he leaves, fingers tracing the grain of the wood. The sunlight has increased from suggestion to presence, and the inn begins to wake fully. The merchants stretch, the noblewoman arranges her single ring, and the pilgrim breathes deeper in sleep. The day ahead will bring more stories, and more ways to fold them into the air. For now, there is satisfaction in knowing that even the most suspicious visitor can be softened by a warm bowl and the steady rhythm of an honest roof. The morning breathes humid and uncertain, as if the sky itself is trying on opinions. You stand at the inn's doorstep, mop leaned against the post like a modest sentinel, and watch the road glisten where last night's dew refuses to choose whether it will become mist or simply evaporate. Travellers gather near the threshold in small clusters, each carrying a personal weather in their voice. One certain of drought, another swearing the year will drown the fields, a third who remembers a winter of such cold that even the moon must have wrapped itself in furs. You find their arguments oddly tender. People argue about weather with the same fervour they argue about losses and loves, because climate becomes memory, and memory becomes identity. A man who insists the last summer that was rainless speaks of parched wells with a poetic sorrow, as if dryness proves endurance. A woman who claims every spring here has always been generous, with blossoms speaks of abundance, as if it were proof that the world still cares. Their convictions are not merely about meteorology. They are small autobiographies, revised to suit temperament. The ribbon seller fusses with her wares near the doorway and asserts, in a tone of wounded certainty, that the wind has been mild this season, soft enough to dry ribbons without tangling them into knots of superstition. The two merchants nod gravely, but the coffer keeper shakes his head and recounts a coastal storm that nearly capsized his boat of goods, describing waves so tall they could have held a church. The shorter soldier, polishing his dented helmet, scoffs at both and offers that no weather is impressive unless you have to march through it. Each tells the atmosphere in colours they prefer, and the inn listens to each telling like a patient judge. You sweep the doorstep slowly, feeling the grit beneath the broom and letting the rhythm steady the morning. The sound of the bristles on the stone arranges itself with the conversations into a kind of orchestra, where each instrument insists its tempo is the truest. The pilgrim, who still fingers his scallop unconsciously, murmurs that the sky blessed him with a sign only when he was most lost. Whether that sign was a breaking cloud or a shaft of sun matters less than the way he felt under it. His description is not wrong. It simply places meaning in a sensation rather than in the strict measure of inches of rain. As the day grows, talk moves from anecdote to explanation. Men and women, unused to discussing climate as a science, find metaphors handy and simple. The apothecary claims that weather follows the moods of rulers because, in his estimation, the land conspires with its masters. The tax collector, ledger under arm like a talisman, rolls his eyes but cannot help noting that rain or shine affects the coin he must collect. Even the noblewoman, disguised still in her quiet way, offers an opinion that the sun favours particular roads. She ties it to a memory of a carriage that arrived at her father's estate with the paint still wet, a memory she speaks of like proof that sunshine itself appreciates good timing. You let such debates spin without interruption, partly because they amuse and partly because they soothe. There is something salutary in hearing people rehearse their versions of the sky. It stitches small communities to a shared concern. When two versions diverge, they do so gently, like two fields planted with different crops that will both feed someone in time. The inn becomes, for an hour or two, a local observatory, its patrons charting seasons with tall tales and precise complaints. Outside, clouds gather and sigh, not ready to commit to rain, but not willing to abandon the thought either. A faint breeze slips through the yard, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and the faint perfume the noblewoman favours. It binds disparate claims into a single, breathing present. You breathe it in and think of how weather is one of those things people use to apologise. I would have been on time, but of course it rained. It is almost always polite to take the weather's side. A farmer arrives with a cart of potatoes, all dust and discipline. He speaks less poetically than the ribbon seller or the pilgrim. His weather is measured in eyes on crops and weight in bushels. Too wet and the tubers rot, he says, tapping the crate as if on a belly. Too dry and they whisper and die. His practicality draws a quiet respect. Facts, here, rub shoulders with fancies without either losing dignity. The merchants murmur about supply routes that prefer dry roads. The apothecary considers which herbs will thrive. And even the soldiers compare mud to morale in ways that sound suspiciously like each other's proverbs. You serve them more bread and pour ale into the mugs with hands that have memorized the contours of cups. Your movement stitches the conversations together, letting one thread catch onto another. Someone mentions a neighbour who swears the wind speaks before it arrives, a charming superstition that prompts the apothecary to demonstrate, with a solemn, pseudo-scientific flourish, how to read the clouds like a book. The demonstration is partly earnest and partly spectacle, and both are welcome in your room. There are moments when disagreement takes on a storytelling quality rather than a disputation. The tallest merchant describes a rain so heavy that it polished the faces of stones, smoothing fences and memories into gleaming newness. The coffer keeper counters with a drought tale so persuasive that the child at the table listens as if the next summer might be determined by his rapt attention. Neither account is strictly true by any measured standard, but each contains a useful truth, one about renewal, the other about scarcity. They become metaphors for the wants and fears undergirding life here. Sometimes weather talk edges into confession. A widow, who has not much to say of late except in small spare sentences, mentions that the year the river rose, she saved a child and lost a basket of seedlings. The admission blooms into something like pride shaded by sorrow, and those around her fold the story into a sympathy that is both practical and warm. The soldiers grumble about mud, but pass a blanket along without announcement. The merchants lower their voices and listen. Weather, in these moments, becomes a shared grammar for hardship and heroism. You notice also how weather stories perform a quiet function. They legitimate absence. When someone says a road was impassable, the inn accepts this without needing proof. It offers a benevolent discount to the truth, so long as the human consequence is small and humane. People do not use weather to deceive in big ways. They use it to explain the small mismatches between intention and reality. As afternoon wanes, the clouds finally decide to commit. Rain arrives as if on cue, first in polite droplets, and then in a steady applause that drums on the roof. The sound is a chorus that hushes talk and draws everyone to the windows like moths to light. Conversations taper into shared silence. The room collectively breathes in the same rhythm as the falling water. Some claim it is an answer to prayer, others a simple turn of climate. You find the sound both consoling and mundane. You step outside with a cloak and let the rain kiss the air. It tastes of the road and of fields and of the small histories spoken here. You stand for a moment, feeling the rain on your face, and think about how many things we attribute to weather. Luck, fate, failure, forgiveness. In the way your patrons have argued and quietly conceded, the rain seems less a referee and more a collaborator, smoothing rough edges and giving new shape to the day. When you return indoors, you find people rearranged by the rain's temper. The ribbon seller has moved closer to the hearth. The merchants plan routes that will avoid flooded fords. The pilgrim fingers his scallop with the old quiet faith that a wet road is still a road. The noblewoman watches the window with an expression that is almost like wonder. Weather has a peculiar democracy. It soaks the lord and the labourer alike, and the conversation in the inn sits comfortably under that wet mantle. You wipe the window and let the condensation bead like little stories waiting to be read. The room glows, warm and simple, and the day's disagreements have settled into companionable truths. Outside, the road will be muddy and the bridges slick. Inside, there is bread, there is gossip, and there is the timeless practice of turning the sky into narrative. You set mugs in a neat row and listen to the rain as if it were another storyteller, one that never needs embellishment. Rain softens into a lingering drizzle that clings to the eaves, turning the world beyond your doorway into a sheet of silver-blurred motion. You stand for a moment beneath the awning, watching droplets gather and fall with the slow patience of an old clock, each bead slipping free as if releasing a thought it has held too long. The road looks rinsed of earlier claims, floods and droughts and wind-wrought disasters, all washed into the same forgiving puddles. Voices inside the inn have grown warm again, shaped by shared meals and the steady cadence of the rain's applause. People have settled into a kind of contemplative ease, where even exaggeration feels softened at the edges. That softness is what the next traveller steps into, as though the room has been tuned to receive him. He arrives dripping but untroubled, his cloak plastered to his back in theatrical folds that suggest he might have practiced the posture. He carries a lute wrapped against the damp and walks with a buoyant rhythm, like someone who has never accepted the idea of bad weather. When he removes his hood, curls spring outward, framing a face designed for storytelling, expressive, eager, and entirely unburdened by fact. You greet him with a nod, and he greets you with a bow so dramatic that the noblewoman instinctively straightens her posture, as though court etiquette has just entered the room unannounced. He asks for wine, not ale, claiming his voice is too refined for barley's rough edges. You pour the cup without argument. The inn has seen many singers, but few who announce themselves with this level of narrative ambition. He tests his lute strings lightly, their dampness making them hum like distant bees. The sound catches the attention of those near the hearth. The soldiers lean forward as though expecting tales of victory. The merchants perk up in hopes of hearing stories of lands they have not yet embellished themselves into. And the ribbon seller begins arranging her ribbons into a pattern that matches the tune's slow measures. The bard clears his throat and begins to speak, promising first a story of his life, though the tone suggests that life for him is a genre rather than a sequence of events. He tells of being born on a night so star-filled that the midwife fainted from celestial awe. The apothecary, listening nearby, coughs politely, but the bard continues undeterred, describing how the stars arrange themselves into the shape of a lute as an omen of his destiny. You refill his cup as though you have witnessed such omens many times. His narrative floats on the wine, gaining height and sparkle. He claims to have been raised by an order of monks who trained him in martial arts, disguised as liturgical dance. A moment later, he says he was raised by shepherds, whose flocks sang harmonies that shaped his earliest melodies. You note these contradictions without correction. They are less errors than musical variations. He begins to play, the notes weaving into the air with confident looseness. The melody shifts each time he takes a sip of wine, sometimes swelling into grandeur, sometimes trickling into introspective murmurs. He tells of a love affair with a queen, but then suddenly corrects himself. No, she was a duchess, or perhaps merely the daughter of a wealthy merchant. The details blur, then sharpen, then dissolve again, like fog in sunlight. People smile at his confusion, not mockingly, but with the fondness one reserves for a child who cannot decide whether to be a dragon or a knight during a game. The noblewoman watches him with a curiosity tinged by envy. Though she must hide her identity carefully, the bard wears his as though it were a costume he is free to change at will. The soldiers, emboldened by the tune, interrupt him occasionally to ask whether he has ever fought in a siege. He answers yes with great authority, then immediately disagrees with himself, saying he merely sang at the siege, inspiring soldiers to such courage that the walls themselves trembled. He grows so enthusiastic in describing the trembling that he forgets which side of the wall he was on. You bring him a second cup of wine, sensing that truth is not a structural requirement for this performance. He speaks next of his travels. In one breath he claims to have journeyed to the Far Isles, where sea serpents bow to musicians of exceptional skill. In the next, he insists he has never stepped beyond this region's borders because the people here love him too dearly for him to leave. The merchants nod with the approval of men who also measure loyalty in coin and flattery. The apothecary mutters that serpents do not bow to anyone, but this factual dissent is drowned out by a flourish of chords that seem to argue otherwise. The bard tells of composing a hymn so beloved that entire villages wept when he first performed it. He tries to sing it now, but cannot recall the melody. He invents a new one on the spot, insisting it is the original. He plays it too quickly, then too slowly, then pauses mid-verse to declare that perhaps it was not a hymn at all, but a drinking song taught to him by sailors who had lost their sea legs and found their dancing legs instead. You catch the noblewoman pressing her lips together, trying not to reveal her amusement. When the room begins to hum with laughter, the bard places a hand over his heart and announces that none of these tales are untrue. They are merely emotionally accurate, which he argues is the only accuracy a travelling artist owes the world. The room accepts this logic more readily than they accept most truths. Emotional accuracy, after all, tends to hurt fewer people than factual precision. Between songs, he speaks to you directly. He asks whether you enjoy hosting so many versions of the world, versions that contradict each other with friendly persistence. You answer by pouring him another cup, a gesture he interprets as profound agreement. He declares you a patron of the arts, a keeper of narratives, and perhaps, after a few more sips, a saint of hospitality. The pilgrim's eyes widen faintly at this, but he does not dispute the bard's enthusiasm. As the evening deepens, his stories soften. The contradictions become less flamboyant and more tender. He speaks of a village where he once stayed, a place he describes with a wistfulness that suggests it may be the only portion of his tale that carries the weight of memory. He remembers an old woman who gave him warm broth and asked for nothing, except that he sing her favourite lullaby. He remembers a child who offered him a pebble for luck, which he still carries, though he cannot recall which pocket. He checks them all twice before giving up. His music slows too, the notes stretching into the long shadows cast by the hearth. People shift into more comfortable positions, letting the melody settle into them like warmth. Even the tax collector, who returned to retrieve a forgotten ledger, pauses near the doorway, caught between skepticism and the soft gravity of the bard's voice. In a rare moment of clarity, the bard admits that sometimes his stories confuse even him. But the truth, he says, is usually too small to live in comfortably, so I give it a roomier home. You consider how many of your guests do the same, offering their truths the luxury of exaggeration so they may breathe more freely. The bard's eyes grow heavy. He plays one final chord, a sound that seems to nod towards sleep. He leans his lute against the bench and settles into a posture reminiscent of someone who has collapsed into their own myth. You bring him a blanket and watch as he drapes it over his lap, with ceremonial gravity, as though enacting the final gesture of a ballad. The rain continues in a steady whisper outside, gentler now, as if applauding a performance completed. You dim the lamps one by one, shadows deepen in reassuring shapes. The bard mutters something about having once performed for a king, then immediately doubts himself, then smiles and lets the uncertainty settle like dust. In the warm quiet that follows, you pass among the sleeping figures. Soldiers, pilgrims, merchants, noblewomen, all wrapped in stories half claimed and half abandoned. The bard's lute gives one last tremor of sound as the wood shifts, as though it too is reluctant to let go of the night. You gather the last empty cup and stand for a moment in the softened glow of the hearth, thinking of how the room holds together so many lives that resist coherence. Yet somehow, in the tangle of contradictions and embellishments, a gentle harmony exists, one that warms the inn more reliably than any fire. And as outside the road cools beneath the steady drizzle, you feel the quiet comfort of knowing that tomorrow will bring more voices, more truths, and more lies that resemble truths, all seeking a place where they can rest without being judged too sharply. Evening folds itself over the inn with a gentleness that suggests it has done this many times before. The rain has wandered off somewhere beyond the fields, leaving behind the scent of wet earth and woods swollen slightly with moisture. Inside, the fire has begun its slow metamorphosis from flame to ember, casting soft red halos across the tables. The bard's lute rests beside him. People drift in and out of conversation, their voices worn thin by a day spent trading versions of themselves. You move among them with a cloth in hand, wiping away rings left by cups and stray crumbs that cling to the wood. There is a certain hush to this hour, not silence, not yet, but the prelude to it. This is when guests begin leaning closer to the truth, drawn by ale and fatigue, only to stop short and take refuge in familiar embellishments. You know the rhythm well. The first confession comes from one of the merchants, the one whose coffer hides its treasures with theatrical secrecy. He sways as he speaks, elbow propped on the table, his face warm with drink. He claims he once lost a fortune bigger than a cathedral, though when pressed to describe it, he falters. The shape of the cathedral changes, sometimes tall, sometimes short, sometimes with spires gold enough to blind angels. His voice trembles with emotion, but the story never sharpens. He is confessing something, certainly, but it is not the thing he thinks he is confessing. You nod softly and listen. What he is truly mourning, you suspect, is not treasure, but dignity. A deal gone wrong, a calculation that ran ahead of caution. He speaks of betrayal, but you hear misjudgment. He speaks of ruin, but you hear embarrassment. He insists he tells you this because the world must know the truth. But the truth remains elusive, slipping away each time he reaches for it. When he finally slumps sideways, half asleep, you guide a blanket over him and tuck it at the shoulder. Even asleep, he clutches the coffer protectively, proof that what he fears losing now is not wealth, but pride. Across the room, the ribbon seller sits with her back against the wall, her ribbons spilling from her bag like a bright, tangled river. She giggles at nothing in particular before offering her own confession. She declares, with a flourish of her hand, that she once danced for nobility so refined they never touched the ground when they walked. She describes gowns so delicate they quivered when looked at. You recognize her tale's aspirations, but when she mistakes the noblewoman's cloak for her own ribbon bag, you gently correct her and return the garment. She blinks, surprised, then claims she knew the difference all along. But then her tone shifts. She grows quiet, almost small, and murmurs that she has not sold a ribbon in 2 days. Her voice cracks in a way the earlier boast never did. She laughs quickly afterward, insisting she is not worried, not at all. She is a woman of opportunity, she says. But the confession lingers. She fears running out of colours before she runs out of road. You place a mug of warm cider beside her hand, and she curls around it gratefully, her bravado settling into something that almost resembles honesty. Near the hearth, one of the soldiers sits with his helmet in his lap, tracing the dent with a finger. The ale has loosened his tongue, but not enough to straighten the curves of his story. He says the dent came from a great battle, a legendary one, though his companion insists, loudly and with competing authority, that it came from a tavern door and a misjudged celebration. Their argument rises, then dissolves into laughter, and finally melts into a joint confession. "I was afraid," says the taller soldier, "so softly you nearly miss it." "Me too," the companion replies, equally soft. For a moment they seem on the verge of revealing something fragile, but then the taller one sits upright and declares that fear is a sign of bravery, because it means you have something to lose. It is a fine sentiment, but it is not what he meant to say. He tightens his grip on the helmet and launches into another story about a siege he never quite places on any map. Their confessions circle the truth like birds afraid to land. You let them circle. Their honesty is not meant to be precise. It is meant to lighten their hearts, the way steam escapes a pot. You touch their shoulders briefly, a practical gesture, steadying the swaying one, grounding the anxious one, and they drift into a quieter companionship. The pilgrim, who until now has listened with drowsy interest, suddenly straightens and announces that he has something important to admit. The room stills. Even the bard opens one eye. The pilgrim rises, wobbles, and declares that the miracle he experienced might not have been divine at all. Perhaps, he says, it was a trick of sunlight, or a kindness, imagined in a moment of loneliness. His voice trembles, but his eyes shine with earnestness. You wait for the relief that often accompanies such revelations, but instead he frowns. Or perhaps, he amends, it was divine, and I am too small to understand it. He sways, torn between two versions of meaning, and both seem to overwhelm him. His confession ends there, unfinished, unresolved. You guide him softly back to his bench, and he sighs like someone who has unburdened himself of nothing at all. The noblewoman, who has been quiet through most of this, lifts her cup with regal poise, though the cup is chipped, and her cloak no longer hides the expensive stitching of her sleeves. She says she has a confession too, a secret that has weighed heavily on her heart. The room leans in slightly. I am, she says with grand seriousness, a simple traveller. No one reacts. She clears her throat, gathers her composure, and says it again, louder. A simple traveller. The ribbon seller claps politely. The soldiers nod approvingly. The merchants raise their cups. The bard, half asleep, plays a chord of agreement. It is the only entirely polite lie told tonight, and everyone treats it with the reverence it deserves. You meet her gaze with a calm, steady understanding, and she relaxes for the first time all evening. The bard, roused by a second wind, begins whisper singing, a confession of his own. He insists, in a tone meant to be secretive, but audible to the entire room, that he has never lied in his life. I merely rearranged truth, he declares, so it appears more elegant. He attempts to stand, forgets that gravity exists, and instead collapses into a poetic heap. You drape a blanket over him, and he murmurs a thank you that concludes with 3 different names for you, none of them correct. You move through the room now with quiet hands, setting blankets where bodies slump, lifting mugs before they spill, smoothing coats where sleep has crumpled them. These small acts of care feel like the closing lines of a chapter that must end softly. Confessions, it seems, do not need to reveal anything. Sometimes they exist merely to reassure their speaker that they are still holding a version of their life that makes sense to them. As you adjust a blanket around the coffer keeper's shoulders, he mumbles that he never wanted riches, only respect. The truth in that statement glows faintly before dimming again, swallowed by his breathing. The ribbon seller mutters that she misses her sister, then insists she has no siblings. The soldiers whisper the names of people they hope have forgiven them. The noblewoman curls her ring tighter in her hand, as though it might grant her courage. The bard finally admits with a dreamy sigh that he has forgotten his own origin story and may need to write a new one. You tuck in each sleeper, your movements steady and unhurried. The room grows quieter, filled with soft murmurs and the faint crackle of the fire. You understand that tonight's confessions, though tender, have not brought clarity. But you also know clarity is overrated. People do not come here for truth. They come here for the freedom to lay their burdens down in whatever shape they can bear. The last lamp flickers. The inn breathes in harmony with the sleepers it shelters. And you stand for a moment in the centre of it all, holding the gentle knowledge that honesty, like weather and miracles and music, often arrives disguised, wrapped in layers of half-remembered wishes. It is enough. You slip out before the square fills, taking the lane that skirts the village green so the early light can find you alone. The air is thin and bright in that short hour when the world still feels undecided. Birds stitch the silence with small industrious notes. The inn behind you sits quiet and steady, a place that holds the night's soft stories like quilts folded in a chest. You want to buy provisions, and if you're honest, to see how the village will dress its morning in confident untruths. The market opens in stages. A cart rattles by first, then a shout or two, then the steady ripple of bargaining voices. You drift into it as if returning to a familiar play, smiling at faces that know you by habit rather than by name. The stalls are already arranged in their habitual disorder, spices in pots that advertise foreign suns, vegetables stacked like small towers, cloths folded to reveal only their most persuasive edges. Each seller greets you as if you are a character in their morning script, someone whose presence obliges them to be at least minimally theatrical. A woman with a basket full of apples insists they were picked before dawn and tasted of dew and heaven. You lift one. It is warm from the crate, not from the morning, and it smells of ordinary orchard. You bite into it and the flavour is honest enough. Sweet, a little tart, yet her eyes shine with the satisfaction of a vendor selling not fruit but the memory of fruit. You buy a few anyway because the story she gives them seems useful. Buyers will taste both apple and tail at your table. A spice merchant with a stall shaded by faded cloth unfurls a small sachet and proclaims the powder inside to be cinnamon imported from an island whose name is whispered like a secret. The scent is pleasant and familiar. Its source is probably nearer than claimed. He gestures grandly, scattering just enough of the spice to swell the air. His pitch is practiced, half commerce, half incantation. You pay him a small coin, more to acknowledge the performance than to secure the substance. In his flourish, he offers you a story. In your pockets, the coin becomes a thank you for that small theatricality. Near the fishmonger, a child cries over a fish that refuses to look dead in the way the vendor promised. The fishman insists it was caught in a storm that tested the very will of the ocean. It might as well have been, for the child's eyes grow large and the market leans into the drama. You hand the child a hunk of bread and watch negotiation in miniature. The child's disappointment soothed by the bread. The vendor's story intact, the world slightly more bearable because everyone performed their part. A cloth seller offers you a bolt declared to be fit for a noble's gown. The weave is serviceable and the colour honest, yet he talks of ballrooms and candles as if they had been present for the dying. You choose a length not for its promise of grandeur, but because it will make fine covers for the common room's benches. The seller's exaggeration, you think, will hang somewhere between flattery and practical utility, an embellishment with purpose. Market days are small theatres where everyone has practiced their lines. People here do not lie to cause harm. They embroider to make the day's trade lighter. A baker with flour on his sleeves puffs up his morning loaf into something akin to legend. Yet when you taste it, the crust yields, with the honest comfort of bread baked well. The baker's pride is mostly harmless. His hyperbole a glaze applied to the simple, necessary pleasures of life. You move through this choreography with the ease of long familiarity. The villagers have ways of measuring the world that are not found on any map. Whose sheep gave the sweetest wool last winter? Which spring will be kinder to barley? Whether the blacksmith's hammer sings truer when struck at dawn? These assessments slide into conversation like familiar tools. Opinions traded as readily as produce. They are not always numerically correct, but they help people decide how to carry on. At the stall of a veteran who mends shoes, you hear a claim that strikes you as both improbable and tender. He says he once marched beside a nobleman who carried no arrogance, only a worn kindness. The tale is unlikely, perhaps, but the veteran's tone tells you he tells it not to deceive but to be listened to. You hand him a coin to mend a strap, and receive in exchange a moment of memory sharpened by sharing. In the market, as in your inn, lies often hides something truer, an old need or a softer longing. There is also commerce of a more practical sort. You haggle over sacks of grain, measure handfuls of salt with an eye that remembers last winter's shortages, and select a slab of cheese with the care of someone who will feed many. The tax collector appears, briefly, prowling among the stalls with a ledger under his arm. Vendors straighten their backs, as if attitude were a taxable good. He asks a question about weights in a voice that has become part of his gait. You offer him a small nod and a smile. His audit is inevitable, but your relationship is negotiated in a dozen small courtesies rather than ink alone. As you gather supplies, your ears collect other market truths. Rumours of a bridge repair, a notice of a travelling fair that will come in 2 weeks. The gossip that the miller's new apprentice is perhaps better at gossip than grain. Each fragment slips into your sack like twine binding the day's purchases. You buy a bit of each, knowing the inn will benefit from both the flour and the talk that comes with it. A child tugs your sleeve and hands you a feather he claims came from a griffin's wing. He insists, with the unshakable conviction of the very young, that griffins nested beyond the northern hedge. You kneel, charm the feather between thumb and forefinger, and praise his imagination as though it were gold. You pocket the feather for the common room's mantle. It will be a curious thing that invites questions and soft smiles rather than a falsity to correct. On the way back, a woman you know well offers you a handful of eggs and a story about how she traded her last loaf for them during a night of moonlight. She insists the moon guided the hand of the trader. You accept her claim with the indulgence of someone who knows moonlight's tendency to make everything seem more neighbourly. The eggs are small and pale, and when you set them in your basket, they wobble with the quiet authority of being real. The walk home is slow. Your sacks sway gently against your hip, each item a small narrative wrapped in linen or tied with string. The market's exuberant fabric of assertion settles into the more sober rhythm of village roads. A cart rattles past, its driver singing an off-key tune that makes you smile despite your careful step. Children dash between the legs of market-goers, their laughter like the unseen spark that starts a pleasant evening. Back at the inn, you unpack with deliberate care. Bread for the day, cheese for suppers, onions that will sing into any stew, and the spices you bought for the way they scent the air when the door opens. You place the griffin feather upon the mantle, beside the pilgrim's carved hand, and the bard's scattered pebbles. It fits there, as comfortably as any truth in this house, because it invites wonder without demanding factual proof. When you set the apples in a bowl and the cloth across the bench, you notice how the market's polite untruths have become part of the inn's atmosphere. Light additions that warm the room rather than chill it. Stories travelled from stall to hearth, trading embellishments like currency. No one was hurt. The world has more colour for the exchange. You light a small fire, and the scent of baking begins to thread through the rafters. The shelves gleam a little brighter with the freshness of new purchases. Patrons will arrive before too long, bringing their own versions of the day to the table. You arrange the bench where people tend to sit when they're ready to tell, rather than barter, and you polish a mug until it reflects a face that looks as if it belongs in a friendly tale. The market has given you more than provisions. It has given you the gentle reassurance that human beings will always find ways to dress small necessities with meaning. The village trades in livelihoods and in language both, and the inn, patient and hospitable, keeps it all in comfortable company. You settle at the counter with a slice of bread and a sip of cider, savouring the way the day's purchases taste both of soil and of story. The afternoon eases into a gentle dimness, the hour when the sunlight begins its slow retreat behind the roofs and chimneys of the village. You set the last of the market goods in their places, apples in the bowl near the hearth, spices tucked in their jars, the new cloth folded neatly over the bench, and feel the inn settling around you, as if it were drawing a deep, preparatory breath for whatever evening will bring. The rooms have that calm before-supper hush, thick enough that you can hear the small crackle of the hearth embracing the first logs. There is work to be done now. Not demanding work, merely the sort that pulls at you softly. The ledger awaits. It lies on the side table, where you keep tools for tasks that rely more on patience than on strength. The book is slightly bowed at the spine, evidence of years spent opening itself to your hand. When you pick it up, the leather makes a faint sighing sound, as if grateful for attention, or perhaps resigned to the familiar futility of being expected to behave like an accounting book. You sit near the window, where the remaining daylight falls in a long, level sheet. The ledger opens willingly. Its pages smell of ink, dust, and the quiet accumulation of months in which careful record-keeping swayed under the influence of human distraction. The first page you see is dated modestly enough, a day near midsummer, if the faded notations can be trusted. You had intended to record the sale of 3 loaves and 2 mugs of ale. What you actually wrote was, "The traveller from the northern hills says the moon rose too early last night, which is why he arrived before dawn. He insists the moon favours him." You read it now with a small breath of amusement. There is no mention of coin. The price of the loaves is absent. The entry is nothing more than a brief, unbothered portrait of a man whose certainty outweighed mundane facts like time and tide. You had written it down because it felt somehow more important than the numbers. Turning the page reveals a similar pattern. A note in the margin, meant to track inventory, instead says, "One of the merchants claims his wagon grew heavier while he slept, though he swears no goods were added. Perhaps the night itself grew weighty." The inventory figure you intended to write has been replaced by a musing. It seems your pen, like many travellers through your inn, has a tendency to wander. Another page shows a list of purchases meant to prepare for last winter. Instead, beside the blank where amounts should have been carefully tallied, you find, "The woman with the ribbons warned of early frost. She said she could smell winter in the air as if it wore perfume." You run your finger along the words. They belong less to bookkeeping than to folklore. Yet here they sit, inked into financial history with the confidence of truth. It is not that you dislike proper accounting. You were once quite adept at it. But numbers measure only one part of life, and you're in, crowded with tales spun like yarns, rumours carried in on wet boots, truths disguised beneath small lies, has tugged you steadily away from tidy arithmetic. These entries should have been columns and sums. Instead, they form a kind of living archive of all the strange, gentle dishonesty that filters through your doors. You pause over a page where the ink has pooled slightly, as if you lingered long in thought before completing the sentence. The entry reads, "Profit uncertain, hospitality steady." The words sit there plainly, unembellished, yet they reveal more than any precise tally could. You know instinctively which matters more for the inn's survival, and for your own ability to wake each morning without dread humming beneath your ribs. The day continues to cool as you read. Shadows lengthen on the pages, turning lines of ink into something textured, almost alive. You imagine your ledger as an oddly shaped chronicle, the sort a slightly eccentric historian might discover and puzzle over. A book whose numbers refuse to behave like numbers, whose margins tell stories with the assurance of having been lived, overheard, or merely guessed at. You turn to the section reserved for debts owed to the inn. Ordinarily, this would be the most sober part of the ledger. Here, however, it is the most theatrical. A few entries are genuine, names and amounts neatly recorded, but woven between them are notes that read like riddles. The man who bartered weather predictions promises payment after the next storm proves him right. The fisherman owes one night's board, to be repaid in stories of the sea's temper. The widow left a loaf in thanks. It was warm and soft and worth far more than what she believed. You realise you've accepted countless forms of payment, some edible, some laughable, some heartfelt. Few are coins, but all are somehow adequate. From the kitchen, a soft bubbling sound reminds you that supper has begun simmering. You let the aroma of rosemary and onions drift over your shoulder. It blends comfortably with the scent of aged ink, making the ledger feel even more like part of the inn's anatomy. You continue reading. As pages pass beneath your fingertips, a pattern reveals itself. Each entry is less a transaction than a vignette. You have recorded not what people paid, but who they tried to be. Their boasts, their tiny deceptions, their longing to be seen. These things captured you more than the weight of their coin. The inn is less a business and more a harbour for the fictions people need in order to remain themselves. You lean back, letting the ledger rest open on your knees. Outside, the faint murmur of travellers gathering at your doorstep rises like the gentle push of a tide. Soon, they will come in. Wet boots, grand claims, half-truths tethered to their belts. And you will welcome them, listening with just enough belief to help them survive their own contradictions. Yet here, in the quiet of late afternoon, you are struck by the realization that your ledger reflects the inn perfectly. A place where truth is tolerated, but not required, where people reinvent themselves as often as they refill their cups, and where lies, if lies they are, arrive softened by need rather than sharpened by malice. You flip to the newest blank page. The paper is crisp, receptive. The day's purchases sit fresh in your memory, along with the market's bright untruths. You could write down the exact cost of the apples, the number of onions, the measure of grain. You could do it properly. Instead, your pen drifts and writes. The market sellers wore certainty like cloaks. Their goods were honest enough. Their stories even more so. You stare for a moment, then chuckle at yourself. There is a kind of inevitability to your divergence from arithmetic. You set the pen down, letting the ink dry. When you close the ledger, you do so gently. No need to punish it for its contents. It is a faithful book in its own eccentric way, holding each tale with the seriousness usually reserved for debts and sums. You place it on the table, where the soft light touches its worn cover. As you rise, the inn seems to breathe in anticipation. The first knock at the door sounds. A polite, uncertain tap that could herald a new story or a simple request for supper. You wipe your hands on your apron and prepare yourself to open the door. Whatever comes will soon find its way into the ledger, not as a calculation, but as another thread in the tapestry of half-truths and hopeful fictions that sustains your quiet world. Your inn, it seems, is not defined by coin or commerce at all. It is defined by the stories people bring and the gentle way you allow them to settle. A repository of comfortable falsehoods, yes, but also a shelter for weary travellers who need, more than anything, a place where even their flawed self-portraits can rest. You open the door. The evening air greets you, and with it, the next tale waiting to be welcomed. The first cool breath of evening slips through the open door as you greet the last traveller of the day, a quiet soul with mud on his boots and a claim about the length of his journey that stretches far beyond the limits of geography. You accept his words with the same ease you accept his coin, steadying the door as he steps inside. The air behind him carries the scent of settling dusk, wood smoke drifting from nearby chimneys, the faint sweetness of trampled grass, the distant murmur of the village finishing its labours. You latch the door with a soft click that feels less like locking anything out and more like gathering the day into a single, gentle exhale. The room responds by lowering into its evening posture. Shadows deepen around the beams, the hearth glows with unhurried confidence, and chairs ease back into their familiar places, as if bracing for their night-long duties. The inn holds a quiet fullness now, the kind that comes only at the end of many small stories told, imperfectly but earnestly. The mercantile bravado from the morning has softened. The half-remembered miracles, carried by the pilgrim, have drifted into the background, like incense. The soldier's boastful exploits have faded into contented sleep murmurs. Even the bard's lute has fallen silent, its last note lingering like a ribbon of memory woven through the rafters. You move through the common room with the kind of slowness that acknowledges the day has given enough. On each table, discarded truths and exaggerated fictions mingle with crumbs, empty mugs, and folded scraps of conversation. There is nothing here demanding correction, only remnants of human need, left behind in a way that feels strangely companionable. The noblewoman slips her ring back onto her finger. The movement small but deliberate. She no longer pretends to hide the gesture. Perhaps anonymity has served its purpose, or perhaps the room's quiet acceptance has blended her disguise into something gentler. Her eyes meet yours briefly, not with the fear of being recognized, but with the gratitude of someone permitted to rest inside a version of herself that is neither lie nor confession, simply incomplete and allowed to stay that way. You stoke the fire, dropping a log into the embers and watching them swallow it with glowing reverence. Sparks bloom and vanish. The flames gather themselves, then settle into a low, rhythmic flicker. It is a light made for evening reflection, dim enough to soften edges, warm enough to draw bodies and stories close. As you straighten the mugs and gather stray blankets, the murmurs of those still awake drift around you. A merchant recounts a tale with such subdued embellishment that it almost passes for truth. A traveller near the window claims he heard wolves howling in the hills, though the tone with which he says it suggests he prefers the idea of wolves to the reality of them. The apothecary speculates about weather patterns, though his predictions contradict everything. He declared that same morning, and the tax collector, who returned briefly to inquire whether he left a ledger here, murmurs that perhaps spoons are not hiding secrets after all. Their voices rise and fall like warm currents in a bath, pulling the room into a gentle, swaying rhythm. You realize that these contradictions, these harmless misalignments between reality and recollection, form the heartbeat of the inn. They drift through the hallways and collect in corners the way dust does, softening surfaces rather than obscuring them. When you carry a tray of fresh bread to the table, the bard perks up long enough to claim he once wrote a ballad about a loaf so magnificent that kings sought it across the realm. The noblewoman laughs, quietly, elegantly, and offers him a slice. He accepts, inspecting it as if searching for grandeur. "It's nearly the same, sire," he declares solemnly, though his grin betrays him. One by one, conversations thin. Guests tug blankets around themselves or stretch across benches with the languid ease of those who know they will not be bothered. Soft snoring begins to weave itself into the texture of the room. The fire hums low, occasionally cracking like a gentle punctuation mark. You check the shutters, closing each with a practiced hand. Outside, the sky deepens into a velvet dark, dotted with stars that might be bright or might be merely your eyes adjusting. But you decide they are bright because some truths are chosen. The crickets resume their predictable argument with the night, each chirp a small insistence. A breeze slips past the frame, cool enough to make you draw your cloak closer, but mild enough to remind you the world still holds warmth. When you return inside, the room greets you with a familiar hush. This is the hour when lies become harmless by virtue of exhaustion. No one has the vigour left to posture. Exaggerations stretch out and go limp, like cats in patches of sun. Even the room's lingering illusions, the griffin feather, the pilgrim's scrap of cloth, the merchant's coffer, seem to quiet themselves, content simply to exist. You lift the ledger from its place on the counter and flip through a few pages, not to record numbers, but to remind yourself of the honest strangeness that accumulates here. Your fingers brush over inked fragments, mismatched memories, overgrown boasts, miracle sightings, weather superstitions, declarations of wealth and courage and anonymity. These scribbles are not records of transactions, but of human attempts to be something more than ordinary. And you, in your quiet role, have allowed every attempt to settle without judgment. The fire dips lower, glowing with the softness of embers that have given all they can. The inn's breaths slow, A few final murmurs drift upward. The soldier hopes tomorrow's road is dry. The merchant insists he once wrestled a bear, though his voice wavers so tenderly that he might actually be confessing fear of dogs. The bard says the stars are singing tonight, though he may be confusing starlight with wine. You dim the last candle. Darkness brews gently. Thick but kind, leaving only the red pulse of the hearth to mark the room's centre. You step carefully between sleeping bodies, adjusting blankets where they've slipped, tucking cloaks around bare shoulders, turning a mug upright where it threatens to spill. These gestures are simple, nearly invisible, but they tether the room into something that feels whole. When at last you sit down, at your usual place near the fire, the night settles around you with the warmth of a familiar cloak. Your mind drifts not toward the day's work, but toward the soft understanding that has grown slowly, almost imperceptibly inside you. Human beings lie for reasons as delicate as spider silk, to feel necessary, to feel admired, to feel forgiven, to feel larger or smaller or braver than they suspect they are. And your inn, in its gentle, persistent way, has become a sanctuary for these small fabrications. Harmless lies that bend toward kindness, toward hope, toward the wish to be held together by a story instead of undone by a truth. You draw your own blanket up to your shoulders, letting the day loosen its grip. A log shifts into the hearth. Someone sighs in their sleep. The night hums its low, steady lullaby. Your eyes grow heavy, not with weariness alone, but with the peaceful knowledge that you do not need the world to be accurate in order for it to be good. The inconsistencies, the contradictions, the impossible claims. They are the music of your days, the soft pulse that keeps the inn alive. As sleep creeps toward you, you breathe in the familiar blend of smoke, bread, wool, and wandering truths. You let your thoughts dissolve into the warm dark, settling into the rhythm of the house. A rhythm built on harmless lies, gentle exaggerations, and the steady, humble kindness that carries all of it without complaint. You rest with a final quiet certainty. Your inn survives not because people tell the truth here, but because they are allowed to be human in all the ways that matter. And the night, patient and unhurried, gathers you into its keeping. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers, Andrew S., Rich Davis, and Leslie Schofield. Sleep well.